So Caroline and I are going to do our best to give an overview of this topic and think about how it matters to our research. But I think in doing this, we do have to recognise that this is a really vast area, thinking about paradigms and philosophical assumptions. Every discipline will have books written on these topics. There's a constant kind of shifting and recategorizing of ideas, and they can differ between different disciplines, and people can use terms in different ways. And there's quite a lot of grey areas, and there can be some debate about different positions and how things are grouped and described. So basically, we're going to give an overview of an approach that we have brought together, but we recognise that this could be looked at in many different ways. And so it would be great if others can contribute as we go through or towards the end with different perspectives or different ways of looking at these issues. What Caroline and I are doing as a bit of a double act through this session is drawing heavily on work by Cresswell and colleagues, and especially a book that he wrote in 2012. And there's been various different updates since then. And I think the latest version is a 2018 version, a Cresswell and Prof production. And I would really recommend this actually as a book to support understanding about research paradigms, interpretive frameworks, but also qualitative methodologies and different qualitative approaches more generally. So we're going to give an overview of what research paradigms and interpretive frameworks are. We're then going to introduce some of the most common paradigms that can be pulled apart and that differ from each other to some extent. And we're going to give some examples, primarily from our own research, of studies that might be located across these different types of paradigms. And then hopefully, if we have time, we're going to, towards the end, introduce, and Caroline will focus on this, introduce and make a link between these paradigms and interpretive frameworks to thinking about developing and using theoretical and conceptual frameworks in our studies. Okay, so many of us in the past or currently have been developing or have developed research strategies. And in thinking about our research strategies, we're thinking about what's the nature of the problem that we're trying to study? What are the questions that we want to ask, the aims and objectives? We're thinking about sampling strategies and different types of methods, right through, because our proposals require us to even talk about what analysis we're going to take and even how we might use our results. We are thinking about this entire set of activities that make up a research strategy. And in many cases, we're bringing these different elements together in thinking about what kind of research design we're using. And there's a myriad of different types of research design out there. Could be an ethnography, an ethnographic design, could be a type of a case study, could be a different type of process evaluation, possibly mixed method. There are many different types of research design out there. What we often don't tend to think about or openly describe in publications, unless it's a very academic publication, is that all of these elements of the research strategy, including the research design, are influenced by underlying philosophical assumptions. And those include within them or have embedded within them different interpretive frameworks about the world, about different types of knowledge, about what type of knowledge counts, and about the different values that are brought into research and the role that researchers play in constructing knowledge. So these types of assumptions are feeding into and influencing our research strategies, even though we're not often explicit about that, or we're not even sometimes entirely aware of or examining that at the time that we're constructing a research strategy. And this can be important to learn about and think about more, because it can very much influence the kind of research design and approach that's taken, the way that the whole problem is seen, the way that the research questions are outlined. So I think the idea of doing this session came from a nice session led earlier by Gloria and Naima on case studies. And I think there was a question about how does the type of case study link back to the philosophical assumptions. And so what we'll go on to show, hopefully, is that the design might look quite different. Even the type of case study and what the case study involves and what it looks like might be quite different depending on the underlying philosophical assumptions and interpretive frameworks that are being applied in a study. So that's just a kind of introductory slide, but just to go into more detail of elements of that then. So in terms of philosophical assumptions, what do we mean by that? So basically all researchers, whether consciously or not, are making certain assumptions when they're designing and undertaking their research. And these are assumptions about what's actually being studied. And these assumptions are based on an underlying view of the world and if and how that world should be being transformed. And so, as I mentioned earlier, this could be assumptions about the nature of reality, about what counts as knowledge, and in producing that knowledge, where do values fit in, and where do the researchers' values specifically fit in? And these types of assumptions are really deeply rooted in the kinds of training that we've all had in our lives. And these assumptions can be reinforced, challenged, shifted slightly by the different work environments that we go on to be part of. In terms of what are those key philosophical assumptions, I've already been mentioning them really, but ontological assumptions are about this idea of what is the nature of reality. So one extreme way to look at this would be, on one end of the spectrum, there's a kind of single reality out there. There's a truth, and that this is out there in an extreme version of this, independent of human experience. On the other end of the spectrum would be that an ontological assumption that there are multiple realities. There is no one reality, and that these realities are constructive, that they're made up through humans interacting with each other and having different experiences. So reality here is understood to be complex, multi-layered, that a single phenomenon might be interpreted in many different ways. So there isn't one truth that's being sought to be understood, but rather a grappling with these multiple realities. So the epistemological assumption, so what counts as knowledge, is how does one actually get to know what this reality or these realities are, and what's the role of evidence, what's considered good evidence here. And so on one end of the spectrum might be a more objective type of evidence, an unbiased objective, unbiased type of objective data to be able to understand that reality out there. And another type of epistemological assumption is that really, to build knowledge, you must understand different subjective experiences, and you must start to understand axiologically now So what the role of values and the role of the researcher is that for on one end of the spectrum, you must understand that a researcher will contribute to those multiple realities, to that layered complexity, and that needs to be included in thinking about, and it needs to be recognized in thinking about knowledge. On the other side would be an interest in making sure that the knowledge is very objective, that one's looking for unbiased or even absent presence of a researcher. So with those, going back to that first diagram I had, that with those broad assumptions, what are the interpretive frameworks? So these are embedded within these philosophical assumptions, and these are analytical lenses or ways of viewing the world. So they bring together those different assumptions. They're frameworks from which one can understand experience, including human experience or realities. And they're a basic set of beliefs that can guide action. So just to build a little bit on what I was already talking about, it might be helpful to think about, in an extreme way, two ends of the spectrum. And I've already been sort of alluding to this really. But on the left-hand side there, you have this dominant paradigm on one end of the spectrum, the positivist paradigm. And the ontological assumption with a positivist paradigm is that this single reality exists out there, and in its extreme form, independent of human experience. And so there's that reality out there that with this could be understood with the right kind of methodologies. And often these types of methods are more experimental, quantitative, and deductive. And the researcher on this end of the spectrum tends to be either absent or not relevant to understanding that reality beyond expertise, or they will have some kind of influence, but the research will aim to be unbiased and to control for that influence. On the other end of the spectrum is more interpretivist paradigm. And this is the one where there's an ontological assumption of multiple realities, this complexity, the multi-layered realities, the single phenomena being interpreted in different ways over time and place and by different people. And the epistemological assumption here is that really it's understanding those realities, the different meanings that are applied to particular phenomena. That's what counts as good quality knowledge and understanding, and that the best way to achieve that kind of knowledge is through a more qualitative, inductive approach. And here, the researcher, far from being able to look at it and understand it almost from a distance, the researcher is part and parcel almost of those realities, of those constructions, of the types of meaning that's given. And so they play a role in producing that knowledge, and they influence what knowledge is received and how information is interpreted. And so the researcher's role and influence is really recognized and discussed in this more interpretivist paradigm. And so just to give an illustration of thinking about TB and how that might fit, just to highlight the extremes. On the left-hand side, it would be around the knowledge and seeking to understand TB as being caused by TB bacillus, and people either know or they don't know the cause of it. It's a fact. On the other end of the spectrum would be that TB and what it means can differ hugely over time and place. It can be constructed in very different ways depending on somebody's wealth, gender, age, all sorts of other contextual factors, including, for instance, other diseases in the area. So this is deliberately pulling apart the extremes of a spectrum, but there are many different positions that particular studies might take along that spectrum, but hopefully it's to highlight some of the differences. So I'm just going to hand over to Caroline now to talk more about deductive and inductive approaches.
Thanks, Sass. I was just struggling with unmuting there, sorry. So yes, as Sass said, there were the talking about the two ends of the spectrum, the sort of positivist end through to the interpretivist end. And associated with those two ends of the spectrum are two different types of reasoning, or two different types of approaches to inquiry. And starting with deductive reasoning, which is a term you've probably heard quite a lot about, that's associated with the positivist or the experimental approach. So in this approach, your study, or the researchers, will begin with the acceptance of the general principle or belief, and then applying that principle to a specific case. So you tend to think about, okay, what is it? What is my theory, and can I test my theory to see if it applies in this particular case? So it involves drawing out or verifying what is already thought of to be true. So it's the experimental approach. Next slide, please.
Ooh, something in the way. Yep.
So it's an experimental approach. It's the sort of approach that you would adopt in a clinical trial, for example. Does drug X work against this particular disease? And you're testing that hypothesis. So you're trying to deduce whether the drug works or not. At the other end of the spectrum, you have inductive analysis, which is associated with interpretive or qualitative approach. And what you're doing here is tending to sort of build a theory about how something works or what's going on. So it involves a process in which general rules evolve or develop from individual cases or observations of phenomena in the naturalistic context. So the researcher seeks to uncover a truth based on the perceptions of the research. So you can see that, as we talked about, the epistemology, whose knowledge counts, and how many realities there are, the ontology, in this sense that the inductive analysis is based on the concept that there are multiple realities, and what you're trying to do is find out what people's realities are and develop a theory from that. And if we go on to the next slide, I think this is a nice little picture that just describes, illustrates really the differences between deductive and inductive approaches, the forms of reasoning and the different processes that involves. So in the top half of the diagram, with deductive reasoning, you start out with a theory or a proposition that you're trying to test. You develop a hypothesis, you undertake a trial or observations to see if that hypothesis holds, and you either confirm or refute that hypothesis. At the bottom end of the slide, we have the more inductive approach, where you start off with the observations. And then when you've done your observations of the particular phenomena, you look for patterns within groups or across groups or within individuals. And from that, you develop a tentative hypothesis and a theory. So you can see that from the inductive, you're sort of starting, you might want to think of it in terms of starting from the bottom up. You're trying to develop a theory about something, whereas a deductive approach, you're tending to test a theory about something. Next slide. And I think it's, oh yes, this is still me, sorry. So those are the two types of reasoning that are covered by the spectrum at either end of the spectrum. As we'll come on to later in this talk, you'll see that some studies might employ both deductive and inductive types of reasoning. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they're the sort of the two ends of the poles. Within those poles, as Sassy talked about, there are various different worldviews that people hold about what is important and what we should be studying. A term that probably many of you have heard is post-positivism, and that is at the experimental end of the spectrum, where all cause and effect is a probability. It's the likelihood that something will happen. Social constructivism is on the, I'm trying to think left from right here. Well, as I'm looking at it on my screen, the diagram we had before, it's on the right-hand side of that diagram. It's the interpretivist end. So post-positivism is the left-hand side, social constructivism is at the right-hand side of that diagram, the sort of the two poles. Other research paradigms that you might have heard about are something called the transformative paradigm, which is based on the concept that there are multiple realities out there. So ontologically, it is constructionist, but the key difference from constructionism here is that the purpose of your research is to transform, and to transform through participatory work. So Sass will go on to describe more about this as in the next few slides. It's more about that the researchers, the research are as important as the researchers in the research process. So the participants are a key part of the research process in the transformative paradigm. A critical paradigm is based on the concept that multiple realities exist, but those realities are shaped by power imbalances. And again, Sass will talk through that more in the next few slides. Pragmatism is an approach that has gained popularity recently with the advent of mixed methods and the advent of a lot of collaborative research, and really also, I think, boosted a lot by the advent of health policy and systems as a research area, because the focus is on what counts, what matters. It's not particularly wedded to any philosophical approach or any sort of, it doesn't give precedence to one over the other. The key issue is what'll work to address this particular question in this circumstance. And again, I'm going to hand over to Sass now to provide a few more examples and a little bit more detail about these 5 paradigms. Over to you, Sass.
Okay, great. So just before going into each of those in turn, it's just a reminder of why it is useful and important to think about these different paradigms and about why philosophy is important. And it's reiterating what I've already mentioned, really, about it influencing the direction of our research goals and outcomes, how we formulate the problem and questions, and that entire research design and approach, all the methodological decisions that we make. Philosophy also influences the evaluations of research that are done by others. So people will bring a philosophical assumption to their reviews of a proposal, to their reviews of theses, including DPhil theses, and to reviews of papers. So sometimes it can be quite frustrating when you've approached a study with one particular set of philosophical assumptions, and you can see it's being read with a very different set. And so trying to articulate more carefully and to think about philosophical assumptions can help to spell this out and hopefully lead to less inappropriate assumptions being applied to a particular research paper or study. And I think it's not always easy well, they're not always stated philosophical assumptions. And so the way that you can start to spot them often is by looking at how studies have been designed, by the types of methods, by the way these are being presented and shared in papers, in proposals, and in papers. Okay, so we're just going to go through each of those different paradigms in turn and just say a little bit more about them and then give some examples. So a post-positivist paradigm, first of all, as I think has already been mentioned, tends to be quite reductionist, logical, cause and effect orientated. There is a recognition that there are multiple different perspectives that exist out there, but it's the researchers' take and understand on those perspectives that's key to this paradigm, their view of making sense of it, rather than trying to understand the meanings that participants and communities give to certain phenomena. As has already been shared quite clearly, I think, often with a post-positivist paradigm, there are theories that are already in place that are being applied. So it's quite a deterministic approach based on a priori theories. The way that you might spot a post-positivist paradigm in papers and in reports, but I think we can come back and discuss this because I think this is we could debate this a bit, but it might be spotted through the way that it's structured, so resembling often quantitative articles. So there'd be a background, a methods, a findings section, then a separate discussion section. And the hypotheses that are being tested will often be there in the methods section. In terms of social science studies, many knowledge, attitudes and practice surveys are based on this paradigm. So just to give an illustration from my own work, and I mention this because I have a very close colleague, an economist, who once said to me over a beer, do you know what, I think I might be a positivist, which was said almost as if there was something to be shy about in saying that, which I think there isn't actually a right or a wrong way of thinking about, or a right paradigm or approach to a particular study. It really very much depends on the question. So I wanted to give my own example of a post-positivist study and paradigm. So this was my PhD work, and what I was interested in looking at is treatment-seeking behaviour for malaria. So I was comparing treatment-seeking behaviour in a rural and an urban area. I was interested in looking at statistical differences in key behaviours between the rural and urban population. It was based on a representative sample of households in each area, and there were hypotheses of what I thought would differ between the two contexts that contributed to the design of the surveys. What we didn't put in here, Caroline, but I think it would be nice to get some examples from others, and that might be worth sort of thinking about, is a qualitative example of a post-positivist study. So if anyone's got some examples immediately to mind, it would be great to share that. But this is possible. So the methods is not directly always linked to the paradigm. So it might be that there's a qualitative study that's got a very clearly articulated theory that's there in advance, and the idea is to test that theory in the field and to use very carefully constructed and stepwise qualitative methods to test that theory. So that might be considered a post-positivist qualitative piece of work. So on the more on the other end of the spectrum almost, so the social constructivism paradigm. Here we're seeking to understand subjective meanings of multiple experiences, recognizing complexity, multi-layered nature, variety, diversity. There's an attempt here to rely on the views and perspectives of participants often, and there's an interest to really try to understand those meanings and those perspectives by getting as close as possible to participants. So being actually immersed in participants' worlds is one of the ways that's considered valuable in getting closest to those views and being able to interpret them. So there's an interest in making sense of and understanding the complexity rather than simplifying things down too much. And the researcher has a real interest on looking at context and how that leads to shifts and changes in what's being studied. And also the researcher's own positionality. So we hear a lot about this in qualitative research. So what's the researcher's own background? What's their own training? Where do they come from? How might their own views of the world influence what they hear, see, are told, and how they analyze and interpret what they're told? And the overall approach is to inductively develop that bottom-up theoretical approach, so developing theory as opposed to testing a priori theory. Caroline, do you want to talk through your example?
Sorry, yes, I can do that. But yeah, so this is an example of a social constructionist approach that was undertaken by a PhD student of mine in the UK, and looking at the issue that was of concern from a public health perspective in the UK was that there's quite a high burden, or the highest burden of imported malaria in the UK was amongst people of Ghanaian and Nigerian origin who visited their friends and relatives back in Ghana or Nigeria. So they're called VFRs, visiting friends and relatives. And there was quite a high, the number of people who were diagnosed with malaria in the UK involved quite a number of these people who fit this sort of categorization. So my PhD student who worked for Public Health England conducted a whole series of interviews with groups of different age and different sex participants to talk to them about what malaria meant to them, what malaria meant to them here, whether they took prophylaxis or not when they went to Ghana or Nigeria, and what affected what they did about malaria. And basically what came out of the study was to try and understand what malaria meant to them from their own perspectives, was that malaria means very different things, even to the same people, but in different contexts. So when, for example, a young woman was in Ghana, she was because of the context, she felt completely safe about malaria. When she was back in the UK, she was very worried about malaria, mainly because of the way the system was set up for diagnosing and treating malaria. In Ghana, she could just go to the corner shop and buy an ACT to treat herself. If she was back in the UK and she came down with malaria, she was going to be put into an isolation unit in the Hospital of Tropical Diseases. So it completely changed how malaria was conceptualized by that individual as they moved between those worlds. So this was the and what Penny came up with was a conceptual and theoretical framework for how these different contexts influenced people's perceptions and their behavior. So the study wasn't set out really to change anything. It was very much an exploratory study just to try and understand the different realities that people faced and the different meanings that they brought to those realities. Next slide. This is another good example of the constructionist approach. I noticed Jake is on the call, so if you want to add anything, Jake, karibu. This was a study that was undertaken as part of the HSDN study that was looking at nurses' ability to cope in the very resource-constrained settings of the public sector in Kenya. They used a rapid ethnographic approach to find out, to sort of really understand the experiences of nurses, both from the nurses' own perspectives, but also from the researchers' perspective. So as Sass has highlighted here, one of the key points about in the analysis and the writing of this study was to embrace the subjectivity of the ethnographer, so of the person who was collecting the data, and embracing the fact that to write out, as Jake has written here, to write out the observer. So, and again, as Sassy mentioned earlier on, one of the key differences between the sort of post-positivist way of presenting your results and your analysis and your data is the way you write about it. And so, for example, in a clinical trials paper, you would never use, or your paper in fact would not be accepted if you used the first person. Whereas in this type of paper, it's very much central to the understanding of the information that's being presented to you, because it's about the ethnographer's engagement with the process, as well as the information that's given to them by the participants. So this is very much on the right-hand side of the spectrum. So it includes a reflection about the ethnographer's role, as well as and how that influences both the data that's collected and the interpretation of the data. And it's also about the fact that you have done the observations, so you're experiencing the context. So how you interpret the information that's given to you in an interview will be different than if you've never spent any time in those hospital wards. So that's where the reflexivity, this reflecting on what has impacted the way you look at the data, is very important as well from a social in the constructivist approach. Okay, next slide, please.
Great, Jake. Just aware that you're there.
Yeah.
Is that? Would you like to chip in at all, or is that a reasonable?
Sure. Yeah, no, I'd probably point people towards the extended case method. I'll put it in the chat. It's one of my favorite methods pieces, but it illustrates well the difference between positivist thinking and perhaps constructionist thinking, in that I think for survey type approaches and that kind of thing, the CATS has a set of principles about reliability and replicability, and I can't quite remember all that. I think there's 4 R's, but Burraway suggests that for his type of research, for ethnography, that it breaks every single one of those rules. And so he argues for 2 types of science, which was pretty controversial at the time and still. But I found it a very influential paper, and I think it speaks to a lot of what you're discussing today. So I'll put it in the chat.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jake. Okay, so the next paradigm or framework is called by Cresswell transformative, and by many others. And I think what you'll see we'll come on to discuss next is a critical paradigm, and I think there's some debate and overlaps between the distinction between the two, but we'll give you a perspective on this and we can discuss it. But basically a transformative framework would see that the post-positivists at one end of the spectrum might impose kind of structural laws and theories that don't necessarily fit well with individuals or groups who are marginalized and underprivileged, whose voices tend to be left out. So they would be concerned about that, and they would be concerned that constructivists or a constructivism approach doesn't go far enough in actually advocating for and pushing for change, so is not action orientated enough. So the ontological assumptions of a transformative framework would be that knowledge reflects inevitably societal, social, and power relations. And the epistemological assumption is that research should include an agenda to reform the lives of participants themselves, the institutions that they are part of, or the institutions that are the focus of the work, and possibly also the researchers involved. And so, as you'll see, there's a lot of overlap with a critical paradigm, and this is often the case with looking at different paradigms. But I think important to highlight here, and Caroline's already mentioned this, is that this is often breaking down the difference between the researcher and the participant. So there's a big focus on collaborative processes in actually conducting the research, in designing the research questions themselves. And for example, the whole package of approaches around participatory action research might well fit into this framework of thinking. And similarly for a lot of co-production research. And so possibly one could argue that some of the work that we've been doing in Kenya, for example, together with colleagues in South Africa, where we've been working with frontline health workers and with health managers to think together about what the key governance health research questions are and how we can best understand and answer those questions. Those types of study are transformative in that they're trying to build in action and collaboration to the research process from the outset. So deliberately trying to change things as you go along. It would be interesting from you all to see if there's additional examples that you have that you'd like to share. As I mentioned, the whole set of activities around participatory action research, where community members sit together with researchers and share ideas about the issues and how they might be studied, also could potentially fit under this transformative framework. So quite closely aligned with this critical paradigm, which feels deeper and broader to me. But here the ontological assumption is that that reality is that lives are made up of inequities between people in terms of many different social locations, including race, gender, sexuality, disability, etc. And so the epistemological assumption is that knowledge must be about empowering participants and challenging traditional research paradigms and theories. So the goal is about, almost it feels deeper and broader than the transformative, at least the way I've just described it, in terms of theorizing about how to transform current orders of social life. So thinking about how the social and political structures that create vulnerabilities can be understood and challenged and transformed. So beyond you can take a critical paradigm without having a collaborative process of co-production, although a co-production process might well take on this broader. Someone's just coming to the door. Great. Al? So there are some overlaps, but a critical paradigm wouldn't require action to be happening, and there would be a deeper and longer term agenda, which might also be the case with more participatory action research and co-production processes. And it's really important that the researchers acknowledge their own power in the research process and in the world, in order to be able to reflect on how they are interpreting and learning about that world. So just to give some examples, possibly, of research that might fit within this critical paradigm. So Evelyn Kabia, for example, this was not an action or co-production activity. It was a basic research as it was, but it was an intersectional analysis aimed at understanding how gender and disability influence the ability of low-income populations to benefit from finance policies that are actually targeting them. And so there was an interest here in an intersectional analysis, and an intersectional analysis has as its kind of roots a transformational social justice aim. So an intersectional lens would understand people's lives as shaped by their social location, all different elements of their social location, recognizing that, so there's that picture on the right-hand side of the slide. The intersectional perspective came from Black feminists arguing that that their lives in America at the time when this was first being discussed could not be understood as similar to white women, and it couldn't be understood as similar to Black men, but that they had a unique set of experiences linked to being both women of colour, Black women, and women. So an intersectional lens would look at, I think it's helpful to have this diagram in the middle there, a person's unique circumstances is shaped by aspects of their identity, and this is inevitably shaped by processes and systems of oppression, such as racism, sexism, ageism, which are in turn shaped by and framed by systems and structures of power, such as capitalism, different types of colonialism. And so there's a critical lens built right into an intersectional approach to doing a study, despite it not necessarily being a participatory action form of study. So it's trying to contribute to new ways of thinking and putting the knowledge of inequity clearly into the picture. So over to you, Caroline, on Paul Farmer's paper.
Yes, so hi. So we just included this paper because this was probably one of the first papers in global health research that really introduced a critical lens that was listened to, if you like, by the global health community. So this was quite a seminal paper in applied health research, because it brought the concept of a critical analysis to a public health problem. And that public health problem was the emergence of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis in Haiti. And basically this study, which I'm sure most of you have probably read actually, takes a critical stance. It's very much written from the researcher's perspective. It's definitely not participatory. It includes elements of document review and literature review, as well as an individual sort of case study. But what it does is it reflects on the issues of power and structure and how those influence the uptake of the TB drugs, and how that then contributes to the evolution of multi-drug resistance TB. And so and Paul Farmer was very explicit about the approach he took, and he was the first person to coin in general use. He adopted a term that was used first back in 1969 by John Gauteng, the term structural violence, to describe the the process that impacted on people's lives and affected their ability to maintain health. So these are social, political, and economic factors that influence their ability to access healthcare, to access good living conditions, to even conceptualize what different forms of life. So the reason that this is included in here is just because this was one of the sort of seminal papers coming from a clinician who started out as a practicing clinician and became a medical anthropologist and activist. In this paper, he took a critical stance. As he's evolved, Paul has become much more of an activist, and more of his work and action has become sort of transformative. But this is a good example of a critical, a study that was undertaken from a critical stance. It was undertaken with a particular purpose of forefronting these issues. Over. I think I was supposed to only do that one, wasn't I, Sass?
I think so. We've attempted to quickly divide these out before today. Yeah, so I think what I'm supposed to do here is show just a couple of studies which could be positioned more. It could be debated whether you would position these in a more social constructivist or a more of a critical paradigm. But for example, there was a Kenyan version of this study as well, but this South African study looking at leadership experiences and practices of South African health managers. So here, there was a recognition that gender would play an influence, and that was part of the interest to explore. But it didn't set out with a intersectional analysis. Whether or not it was a critical framing that was at the root of this study could be debated. It was an exploratory study exploring different managers' experiences over their career lives and factors that influence that. And what emerged and what was described a lot as part of the findings and conclusions is the importance of this intersection, not only between gender and race was much stronger as an influence in South Africa for obvious reasons than in Kenya, but also, and very importantly in Kenya, professional hierarchy. So in the end, one of the conclusions of the paper is that it would be important to examine these issues more carefully with an intersectional analysis framing from the outset, which would be arguably more of a critical framing from the outset. And taking that a step further is another paper by Coy, which was part of her PhD. And in her methods section of her PhD, she mentioned that this study was a social constructivism paradigm. But she also applies, as she often will from her interpretation of the world, as with many of us, a gender lens to the work. So this was a study a qualitative study in rural Kenya, trying to understand how moderate undernutrition is recognized, understood, experienced in different households, and what happens in terms of decision making around seeking care. What is normal health in children, and when does something become considered and labeled as something that needs extra attention or care from outside the household? And the centrality of gender in every aspect was highlighted as part of the findings. So just to begin to show really some of the blurred lines and potentially just combinations between different paradigms that are brought to studies. So the final paradigm to talk about is this pragmatist or pragmatism paradigm. And here, I think Caroline described it nicely. There's not a particular commitment to one system of philosophy. The reality is what's useful. So the ontological perspective is reality as what's useful, practical, and what works. And the focus is very much in the knowledge generation of the practical implications and the outcomes of the research, with methods being selected across the whole gamut according to what's best to meet those practical needs and purposes. And this, increasing volumes and attention to mixed methods, many types of case studies might well be based on a pragmatic paradigm. I think what's quite interesting in terms of what counts as a pragmatism paradigm is to what extent it's actually also drawing on different philosophical backgrounds in terms of conducting one study. So just to illustrate what I mean by that, I described earlier that part of my PhD work was a post-positivist approach to exploring maternal treatment-seeking behaviour for fevers and convulsions, actually, so linked to malaria. But actually the hypotheses that were tested in that survey work were based on quite in-depth qualitative work and very much informed by me living in a village for quite a few years, a peri-urban area of Kilifi. And there's an element of that PhD, the more qualitative work, that was very social, very much in the social constructivism paradigm, around really trying to understand households, how household relationships work, what kind of decision-making power dynamics there are within households around child illness, and eventually using a cooperative conflicts model to try to make sense of what I was seeing in terms of household age and power relations. So in those days, so many decades ago, where we weren't thinking about whether this is a pragmatist approach of drawing on two different paradigms and incorporating them in one study in order to work out, to use the best set of methods to understand and answer the questions that I was interested in. But it could be argued that is what my PhD was. It was it was falling in this paradigm, and it was bringing together different elements and different thoughts from different philosophical backgrounds in order to reach the type of knowledge and combinations of knowledge that I needed to answer my overall questions.
Sorry, just to quickly put in there, Sass, the other thing I think that is important, and you'll get on to when you talk about the mixed methods session, is that clearly this work was mixed methods work, and today we call it an exploratory sequential design. But back in the day, we didn't have terms like that. We did mixed methods, and we just called them mixed methods. We didn't have particular labels for them. So I think it's just really an illustration of how these things evolve. We are constantly evolving our ways of thinking, our ways of labeling things, our ways of doing things. So, and different disciplines use similar terminologies to mean different things. So again, don't get worried if there are people are using things in slightly different ways. You need to check which discipline they're coming from when they're using those terms. And you also need to look at when the paper was written, for example, because if it was written back in the 70s, it might be using different terminology, and the way people think about things has moved on since then. Over.
Thanks. Just to clarify to everybody that I wasn't actually writing papers in the 70s. I'm not that old. But you meant other papers, right? So, Al, you mentioned in terms of epistemological approaches when you were doing the PAR, talking about some of your participatory visual work, that you would generally put your work in a more in a pragmatism framework or paradigm. So, I mean, it would be interesting to discuss that. And it's possible that there are elements of your work that you could also think of as being quite transformational, I think, or in following a transformation framework. But perhaps really clear examples of pragmatism in terms of the approach taken and the assumptions in research, or a lot of health policy and systems research, including, for example, this very recent paper that's just come out in the last couple of weeks, looking at program-based budgeting and trying to draw on the data that's out there, all the various different forms of data, to just understand what's going on in order to inform policy about how to potentially strengthen budgeting processes. So over to you, Caroline.
Sorry. Okay. So yeah, this is just a slide that, again, Sass and I have found quite useful in terms of just synthesizing and summarizing everything that we have just been talking about. So you've now seen the examples of each of these different paradigms. And this slide is basically summarizing the ontology, the emphasis in epistemology, and the reasoning and approach to analysis associated with each of these paradigms. Positivism and post-positivism. And I don't think we talked about the difference between those earlier on. I think the difference between those is that positivism is actually that there is only one single reality. It's not that there are any allowance for any different realities. And I think that there's probably and post-positivism arose from positivism with the recognition that there are a variety of realities, but the one that counts is the one that you're investigating, and it's the researcher's view that's important. If we go back to those earlier slides. And that reality is knowable, and that knowledge is validated by peers and not by participants. So you're doing a clinical trial of something, you don't ask your participants, you validate, your results are validated by the data that you collect on the health status of those individuals who are involved in the trial. And that is validated by your peers and can be questioned by your peers. And it's important to have your correct study design, for example, and your sample size. Those are the things that matter in terms of what makes your data valid. So society is studied empirically and scientifically, and you use a deductive approach. Social constructivism is constructionism. Anyway, that there are multiple realities constructed through experience and interactions, co-created findings, and multiple ways of knowing. However, the findings may be co-created, but the involvement of the participant is not as imperative paradigm. The process itself is collaborative for the transformative paradigm. The critical paradigm is that reality is based on power and identity struggles, and it's through the study of social struggles, these things and changing it through the research on it. And the assumption is involve the participants in that, in calling. And pragmatism is, as Sass has just been describing, reality is what's useful and what works. And I'm going to hand over to you, Sass, just for this next slide while I go and find out what's making. while the dog's making that noise. Over.
Yeah, so basically, just in conclusion, really, research can be undertaken based on any or in different types of study and approaches to doing that study, and that the different paradigms can apply. You can have a post-positivist social science study, health policy and systems research can go right across that spectrum and take all the different types of approach. And so it's not a direct map of discipline or a direct map of methods against these underlying research paradigms. And our thinking was that you can move beyond thinking about a paradigm as it applies in a particular study. So it could be, for example, that a paradigm applies to a whole program of work. So I'm just thinking here about the Lancet, and they've recently commissioned 2 separate, one race and one gender commission. And those groups are interested in conducting research and action around those issues. And I think there's not much doubt that there's a critical paradigm that's underlying all of the activities that the people involved in those commissions will be undertaking. There could be different paradigms that are applied for different questions or sub-studies within broader programs of work. So it could be that, for example, with previous health systems work that I've done under a consortium called RESIST, we had some work that would be very much a post-positivist approach to trying to understand some of the economics, for example, in different countries, as well as some quite critical work around intersectional approaches, as I've mentioned earlier, and bringing an intersectional lens to different people's experiences and realities within health systems and within communities. And I think you might want to talk about it as well in relation to CIN, but many of these big programs of work deliberately are interdisciplinary and deliberately are bringing together different paradigms, ways of thinking together in order to meet their objectives and goals. It could also be that a different emphasis on paradigm is given for analyses of data. So, for example, with anthropological data, and perhaps this is a little bit what I was suggesting of when I shared Coy's paper, is that it might be more of a open, inductive, broad, interpretive study, anthropological data, trying to understand realities in relation to a particular situation, and then there are more critical theories or analyses that are applied to that data. And so it might be that at one stage of the research, it looks more orientated around one paradigm, and that shifts over time or in types of analyses.
Great. Okay. So Sass just mentioned there about applying a critical theory when you started off from a different paradigm. So I just wanted to do 2 very quick slides, and I'm not going to talk about social theory in any depth at all, but I know that there's sometimes a bit of confusion between, well, what's a paradigm and what's a theory? So a theory is a way of looking at the world and understanding human interaction, and a way of explanation, a mechanism for explaining what you see. So, or explaining what you've observed or what you've heard. And I like this is highlighted in red, and I cannot remember where I saw it now, but it's on this slide. So while paradigms can be seen to point out a general direction, theories can be used to map out the explanation, the why, the how, and the how behind the why. So, for example, you might be using a critical paradigm and thinking that power inequities are going to be central in this problem that you're investigating, but there are many, many different theories of power. So what your theory does is will explain why and how that is working, and depending on which power theory you decide to adopt, you'll be looking at your data in a particular way. So it's a structure for ways of looking at the data and thinking about their meaning. And then next slide, please. And in practice, how you can use social theory, you can test a theory. So the positivist approach would be a theory, for example, that your maternal education is, your hypothesis is that the level of maternal education is associated with treatment-seeking behaviours for malaria. And you can go and test that using a quantitative survey, for example, looking at treatment-seeking patterns and levels of education. So your theory is identified, and you design your study to test its applicability or its effectiveness. Is it as I think it is? You can apply a theory. So you can apply a theory. Your theory, you might specify your specific theories. For example, the Luke's theory of power. You might say that my study was designed using the Luke's theory of power to investigate this particular issue. You're not testing to see whether that theory is true or not, but you're applying it and its constructs to help you design your study. Informed by theory is more, is sort of one step back from that. So for example, when I'm thinking about applying theory, you might think a lot of studies will, for example, studies of implementation might apply the behavior change wheel or the COM-B framework. So you apply that theory to your study, and you design your study around those theories of behavior. You might take a slightly less structured approach and think about your study being informed by theory, where your theories guide thinking, but the constructs are not imposed on the study. So for example, the Foucault's power lens you might use to analyze and interpret data, but you don't use it to structure your data collection tools, for example. And then the final way that we're talking about today, I'm sure there are many other ways, but these four key ways theory can be used in social science. You can build a theory. So again, your theory, this is very much on the right-hand side of the diagram, where you go in and you look at what's happening and you build your theory from that. It doesn't mean that you necessarily, you don't have a paradigm that you start from. You have underlying philosophical assumptions and an underlying paradigm, an underlying critical paradigm or transformative paradigm, for example, but you don't necessarily have any specific theories. But as you collect your data, you may think, oh, now that social theory might be quite useful to help explain this. So you build theory in tandem with your data collection. And you might use more than one theory. And again, in all of these, in your positivist, you're tending to test one theory in a study because it's quite difficult to test more than one using a positivist framework. Someone who comes from that perspective might like to correct me on that, but my view is it's quite difficult to test more than one hypothesis at once. But in these other forms, you may use more than one theory. It's not just that you've got one particular theory. Sorry, I think I lost you there. Yeah, it's not just necessarily one particular theory. Okay, and I think because we literally have 10 minutes left, we'd probably better leave it there.